Thank you for joining us today. My name is Allison Van, and I'm the Executive Director at SPARC, a Center for Social Research Innovation. Welcome to today's SPARC Talk. We all make mistakes. We all make mistakes. Stories of social research gone wrong with Akacia Propst and Brianne Morgan, as well as Taylor Peacock will be joining us briefly. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to this land. Akacia Propst, Brianne Morgan, and Taylor Peacock are three anthropology graduate students. Akacia and Brianne are currently PhD students here at McMaster, and Taylor is pursuing her PhD at Cambridge. This project originated from discussions around perceptions of science and publishing standards while at a conference, and has grown from there into the Null Hypothesis website and blog. So thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to hear from you.
I'll just share my screen. Not that part of it. There we go. Okay. Okay. I guess we'll get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianne, and today, along with my co-presenter, Akacia, and our other co-founder, Taylor, we're going to be talking about a project that we've been working on, and it's all about failure, essentially. We're both PhD students at McMaster, and like anyone who's ever been involved in any kind of research, we've all had our share of mistakes or odd moments or unexpected twists that have happened over the course of that research. We've called this presentation Science Gone Wrong, but a really important point that I want to stress at the beginning is that failure and unexplained or unexpected moments and results are built into the research process. So wrong, quote unquote, is kind of a misnomer. The point of what we're talking about today is just to encourage discussions around things that have gone wrong, or just things that have been unexpected throughout the research process. So just to give a brief overview of what this talk will look like, we're going to start out with a few case studies to get you thinking about why science communication and sharing research stories behind the scenes might be important. The point of these case studies isn't to say that science communication or increased discussion of research failure is going to solve the problems presented in these case studies, but just to give you an idea about why we might care about this topic. From there, we'll talk a little more specifically about what science communication is and why it's important, and then we'll talk about our own project and how we hope it can play a role in facilitating some of these wider discussions. And then finally, we have some examples from both us and other colleagues about how their research has gone wrong. Again, those quotes, air quotes around the word wrong there. Okay, so to start out, I'm going to briefly talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's affected public attitudes and perceptions of science and research. So as I'm sure you all know or could guess, the pandemic really highlighted the importance and impact of scientific research around the world. However, the results on whether overall public trust in science has increased throughout the pandemic are mixed. Some studies have found that there's been an increase in trust, while others have found that overall trust has decreased and negative attitudes have decreased. One thing that is consistent between all these studies is that they have demonstrated a greater degree of polarization between groups that have trust or have distrust. In some studies, this is manifested as significantly fewer undecided respondents towards in surveys and questionnaires. And then in other studies, it's manifested as simultaneous decreases in trust in some groups and increases in trust in other groups. Generally, these groups are divided along political lines or political differences. Some of the most commonly cited reasons for distrust during the pandemic include that scientists often make mistakes, they adjust results to meet their own expectations, scientists are beholden to funders and stakeholders, sorry, so they might manipulate data or manipulate protocols to meet those demands. And then finally, that scientists are withholding knowledge on the coronavirus itself. Another issue that has arisen has to do with scientific uncertainty. In a German survey on public trust in science after COVID-19, only half of individuals agreed that scientists were clearly articulating what they did and did not know. And this has kind of led to mixed things. So on one hand, some studies have found that reporting uncertainty can be misused or misconstrued, particularly in political settings. But on the other hand, so it might be leading to mistrust in those cases. And on the other hand, communicating uncertainty can help build trust in the short term. And withholding that uncertainty and information is another factor in how trust is lost. So there's a very fine line to walk when communicating about uncertainty. Things like reversals of information, fast research or publishing speeds, and inaccurate prediction models, particularly during the early days of the pandemic, were especially contributing to mistrust and uncertainty. Even though these are things that are kind of expected as part of the research process. And this disconnect regarding uncertainty comes about because scientists and researchers may understand why these uncertainties or why things are moving really fast. They might understand why that's happening, but it's really hard to effectively communicate about that. And then the second case study we wanted to introduce concerns graduate student mental health. In an article published in Nature in 2018, Evans and colleagues refer to the state of mental health among graduate students as a crisis. And other studies have also kind of adopted this term and used it since then. Further institutional studies have found that nearly half of their entire graduate student cohort were considered depressed, and that surveyed students felt as though they experienced tremendous or higher than average stress due to specifically their schooling and education issues. The Evans and colleagues study reported that graduate students are 6 times more likely than their similar aged peers to experience depression and anxiety compared to the general population, with things like the pressure to produce data and compete for funding being significant drivers of this. Reported prevalence of imposter syndrome, sometimes called perceived fraudulence, has also been increasing in recent years. Increased proximity to faculty and to other graduate students or graduate cohorts are thought to be some of the main drivers behind why this increases between undergraduate and graduate years. And one study found that as many as 96% of students that they surveyed, which was mostly graduate students, feared making a bad impression with faculty and doubted the sort of quality of their research and results. Factors that have a positive impact on student mental health and well-being include social support and feelings of social belonging. And some studies have found that something as simple as having a dedicated physical space to interact with other students can help address feelings of isolation. None of this is to say that talking to each other about these issues or communicating more effectively around science is the solution to this crisis, but just that talking about these things and again having spaces to talk about those things has been found to reduce stigma and subsequent stress. Okay, so hopefully with these brief case studies, we've been able to highlight the importance of having conversations around these topics of uncertainty, failure, and the overall research process. Again, just to reiterate, it's not the end-all be-all solution to some of these problems, but effective communication can be an important step in bridging some of the gaps that were raised in these examples. The science communication itself involves, it can be a very large definition or it can be very small, but we've opted for that. It involves sharing research results and outcomes with a wider audience, as well as facilitating discussions around science-related topics more broadly. So it may involve sharing the motivations behind why research has been conducted or the process of how that research has been done. So giving others an inside look at how the research came about, essentially. Usually in this sort of concept of science communication, the audience is considered to be kind of a nebulous public, but that can be a little bit problematic as it creates an in-group and out-group divide between academia and academics and other people. Additionally, as I'm sure most of us know, being an expert in one area of academic research doesn't necessarily mean that you know more than the general public about another area of academic research. So for these reasons, many science communicators recommend thinking of the audience, who you're communicating to, in a more broader sense, and emphasize how important it is to actually tailor your communication to that specific audience that you're going to be presenting to. So this may mean that the way you communicate and what you're communicating changes depending on the audience. There's a general expectation of researchers and of scientists that their work will contribute to the well-being and growth of society. And part of this is that we'll actually be able to share that work and explain that work to others. And so for this reason, science communication has been an expected and an important part of being a researcher. But as we've seen, especially from the pandemic example, science communication is a skill that needs to be honed and practiced. It's not as simple as just sort of sharing your results out there and letting other people decide what to do with them. So why is science communication important? There are a number of general reasons, but what you're communicating about and what you're trying to share can also affect this answer. Sharing results and outcomes helps us to capture public interest in science. In our field especially, this tends to be things about very morbid topics. People are very interested in the Black Death, so that tends to get talked about a lot. And learning about results in this context can help people feel more invested in the results. And everyone can feel like these answers matter to them, particularly for results that are relevant, again, to sort of modern interests and questions. Communicating results also allows science to be more accessible, so you don't need an academic journal subscription to find them, which can further encourage discussion around specific topics. And again, facilitating those discussions is a really important part of science communication. So results-oriented science communication, sharing the specific outcomes of research, is beneficial for the reasons articulated on the previous slide, but there's kind of another half to science communication, and that's sharing the motivations or process of the research. Often this may involve community-based consultation, and communicating effectively can lead to the integration of community-based knowledge and practices, which is really important. It can also help communities to become stakeholders in the project, which again just allows everyone to feel invested in it. Part of science literacy is understanding the scientific process, which allows and expects for failures. And so communication about the process behind research can also help promote more realistic perceptions of the research process. We look at this lovely diagram here of the scientific process. We can see that things going wrong, the sort of yellow bits here, things going wrong or hypotheses being rejected is a key and also expected part of research, which is something that's, I think, very important for all of us to hear and remember. From this diagram, we can also see at the bottom here how communicating results is the last step of research, and communicating results should also include wider dissemination of results outside of just your academic community. So that's science communication more broadly. Sharing the motivations or processes behind research plays an important role in addressing some of the issues presented in the case studies we highlighted at the beginning of this as well. So hopefully by talking a little bit more about the behind the scenes process, we can help address those misconceptions of what science research is, or address those feelings of isolation and separation that can occur in graduate. All right, switch to Akacia now.
Yeah, so the next question is, how do we do science communication? We have a lot of places we can share our work now, especially that there has been increased emphasis on science communication going on in many fields and more discussions talking about it. We have a number of examples here shown on the slide that you can see where we can share our research in venues outside of those academic settings and academic journals. And many universities will now share and promote their own research. And often we have offices that can help us communicate with journalists as well, which is great. Another venture is podcasts. So that's really been an incredible new avenue for sharing research and can really help you go to much wider audiences. And many researchers today have even started their own blogs, or they've created these science communication accounts on Twitter and other social media to highlight theirs and others' works. But all of these things are overall, they're very research oriented. So you're often just sharing the final results of your research. And one problem is we still don't have a lot of science communication dedicated to the process of scientific research. And much of the research process really remains behind the scenes, and that goes for wider audiences, including researchers. So even as researchers, when we're reading an article or we're reading research, we often, other than the main hits of the method, don't really see what all of that entails. And for graduate students, we've been kind of anecdotally picking up in our conversations confusion on how to navigate these resources, how to submit to these resources and share your research. It can be really intimidating and hard, and we're also very busy. So it's hard to, go out to try to submit an article for something, like the conversation or things like that, when you're also working on writing a dissertation and articles that you need to graduate. And these pieces of writing are typically considered yet kind of academic writing that can contribute to progress towards your degree. So all of this was ultimately the main inspiration for our own project. So Taylor, Brianne, and I have created, and in many ways are still actively creating and updating our project, which is called the Null Hypothesis. And this is a science blog for sharing research stories, art, and more. We started to develop it through the digital residency at the Sherman Center here at McMaster. We are new to website building and website design, so that has been a learning curve and challenge. But we've got the website, and now we are starting to collect and build more content to really build up the website. And the first idea, this actually, as we spoke to in our introduction, so this project came out of conversations we were having at a conference where we're talking about how all of us has experienced, new people or had seen kind of challenges to publishing research that had non-significant results. And as we've kind of touched on here and said before, as researchers, we've been told that non-significant results are integral for the research project. You have to know what doesn't work in order to figure out what does work. But publishing standards don't often reflect that. So we had actually originally come up with this idea to make a science blog that would create a space for researchers to share these types of results in a less formal and more approachable style, and where we could ideally build a more open place to do so. However, like with so many things over the past 3 years, our ideas shifted. In this time, we've seen a greater push for greater science communication or public outreach. And as we've seen this, for us, it's still difficult for graduate students to do so. And along with everyone else, we're also going through the COVID pandemic. And as Brianne talked about earlier, we're seeing kind of the skepticism and mistrust in science that arose as people saw the scientific process happening in real time. So we felt it was important to create a space to highlight what research looks like behind the scenes, which is human, often messy, and rarely straightforward. So over this time, we shifted our focus to the project to be more on that research process and sharing the different parts of science more generally. So our mission for this project is to help demystify the research process, promote greater scientific literacy in public audiences, and create an open and safe space for researchers to share their unexpected research experiences. We're hoping it will offer an opportunity to develop skills in science communication in a lower stakes environment, particularly for graduate students who don't often have a space to do this. And we hope it'll will provide researchers a way to connect with others who have experienced similar setbacks and blocks in a way that's engaging for non-researchers or public audiences as well. So on our website, our main section is the Scientist Tales section, where users can submit their own stories about whatever they are comfortable with sharing. Its purpose is to be an approachable place to share what science looks like behind the scenes for researchers and non-researchers. Users can share stories anonymously or not. We currently have it set up that you need to be a member to submit content, but you don't need to input your name or anything like that if you don't want to. And the idea is that people can share things in an informal tone that will be accessible to wider audiences. And we want this to be about research generally, so all different fields of science and research. We're coming from anthropology, but we'd love to see from all the different disciplines. And submission could range from unexpected happenings in the lab, research ideas or research that turned out to, not go anywhere, or success stories that didn't at all start out successful. So we really want it all. And most importantly, we want it to build an open and inclusive space that people can feel comfortable sharing their stories. And we know this really isn't always easy, and the stories that we want or even feel we, need to share aren't always, easy or lighthearted to do. And even in adding our own content, I can say for myself, having those deliberations like, oh, which story do I share? If I share this, will it make me look bad? And, that's really is to say we experience that same thought process as ourselves, and that is exactly what we're hoping to try to break out of, because it's all science, and just because you have flops doesn't mean it's not good science. So for the second half of the talk, we wanted to be able to bring you some examples of the research that didn't go as planned, and we hope some of these stories will get you starting your own conversations or feel like you can relate to these things that other researchers have gone through. These are also on our website, so it's examples of the types of posts and stories others might share as well. So this one was mine, and based off fieldwork and data collection that I was doing just last year. And it's called Wish Upon an Elevator. And mine was about having to get my samples to the lab where I'd be doing my data collection. So not all samples live in the lab. Sometimes they need to be transported from where they're being stored to where you're doing the data collection. And sometimes old European buildings do not have elevators. Sometimes labs are located on the third floor of old European buildings without an elevator. And sometimes archaeological materials can be very heavy. So sometimes you and your host or your colleague have to carry 40+ heavy boxes up 3 flights of stairs to a lab in old European buildings without elevators. And sometimes you just have to hope that your host isn't deeply regretting their decision to allow you to do research at their facilities afterwards. And then story 2 comes from the west coast of Canada. So we have a collaborator, Rowan, she designed the main logo for us and other graphics for our website. And she was involved in salmon catching and counting for a population study just off the coast of Vancouver Island. And sometimes the risk can be bigger than you think. So while running into grizzlies is a de facto part of working in the BC wilderness, sometimes that part makes research impossible. So on one occasion, they were working along the shoreline. Rowan and her supervisor saw a mama grizzly and decided they would try and mark and recapture the salmon anyway to try to prevent losing a day's work. So they were trying to move around her, but the bear also did the same, kept moving around them. And the two sets were orbiting each other. And after 3 or 4 minutes of this dance, the mama had clearly had enough and turned and started huffing. So Rowan and her supervisor were required to ditch all their equipment and leg it back to the truck, which means speed walk and then straight sprint to their truck until they had gotten to the safety of the car. And then they just had to sit there and wait for the rest of the afternoon for the bear to actually leave, and lost all their work in the process.
Okay, so I will take over and do some of the last few stories here. So this is my story. This is a little bit about my own research, which generally involves taking some kind of a photo of a bone and then trying to do something with that photo on a computer. So this could be an actual photo or a radiograph or a CT scan or a digital microscopy photo. I've done all of those things. But whichever one you're doing, either way, it's really important that the piece of bone doesn't move throughout the process. And I've had to use a variety of methods or objects to make sure that that doesn't happen. So my research story isn't so much of a story, but it's more of a list of absolutely everything I can remember using to secure a sample or take some sort of photograph, in the hopes that maybe that can de-glamorize a little bit the process of using very fancy and expensive machines as part of your research. So the first few things are fairly standard. We have masking tape, duct tape, double-sided tape. And there we go into toilet paper tubes. That's for use in a CT scanner. We have bean bags, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Floral foam and styrofoam coffee cups. That's in this image here. And that was the most useful thing for securing bone in a CT scanner. This is a rib cup I made specifically to hold ribs. So that's fun. I also have made a homemade turntable from a poster board, a cereal box, and some cardboard. And that worked for a little bit, but I eventually switched to a rotating plastic cake stand that worked much, much better than the homemade turntable. I've used one of those green paper cutting mats with the grid lines on it as to try and we were fiddling around with scales. Fish gravel, a camera cap lens to hold the fish gravel, a takeout container to also hold fish gravel for the bigger bones, foam stickers in the shape of flowers. This was also trying out unobtrusive scale options, but we didn't have any other stickers, so we had to use these, and they weren't actually all that unobtrusive. White bed sheets and pillowcases, a 4-foot by 8-foot black velvet backdrop that I had to pack in my suitcase. I was expecting it to be 4 by 8 inches, so that was a problem. And then finally Play-Doh, which is good for securing things, but annoying to edit out afterward. So the moral of this list or of this story is to find what works, no matter how unconventional, and that sometimes a styrofoam cup is all you need to get the really, really expensive micro CT scanner to work. And then to build on this story, this is from Taylor, our co-founder. During her master's thesis, she was part of a project that analyzed dental thin sections using a fancy Keonce digital microscope. So that's this in the picture here. Unlike a traditional microscope, the platforms of the Keonce move to allow for larger image processing. And so the slides aren't actually secured to anything. They kind of just float on the platform. One aspect of the project that Taylor was doing involved stitching together really small images across the slide into one large mega image of the whole thing. And that can take about half an hour or so to do one, and Taylor had about 8 or 9 teeth. So it was only a few hours of work, or it should have been only a few hours of work. Now, for some context, the microscopy lab is a rather small closet-like room that unfortunately backs onto several classrooms, one of which was a music room. On the day in question, Taylor goes to process all the slides and everything's fine, it's all quiet. The first slide is done, everything was stitched together perfectly, it looks great. Seems like this is gonna be a breeze. On the second slide, Taylor can hear the music room next door start to come to life, and the orchestra starts playing. At first she thought, oh, this is great. I get to stand here at this microscope and listen to classical music. How amazing, that sounds fun. However, as you can probably guess, the second image was a little bit blurry, something had gone wrong. She wasn't sure exactly what had gone wrong, so she just started the process over again. And yet again, the image was blurry. She keeps trying, and an hour goes by. The music room in the background, in the meanwhile, is in full swing and very, very loud. It wasn't until the fourth try or so that she realized that the open platform, the unsecured sample, and the classical music was not a good mix. The vibrations from the music room meant that the slides were shaking ever so slightly as the microscope moved, which was ruining all of the images and meant that it wasn't going to be possible to complete the work until the band stopped playing. And just as a side note for me and my own research, the reason I brought beanbags with me to do my own field work was because I was using the same microscope, and Taylor had warned me of this exact issue. So I knew I was going to have to try and stabilize it somehow, or stabilize anything I put on the platform. Hence the beanbags and also the fish gravel. That was what that was for as well. And this just further highlights why sharing and talking about our failures or things that have gone wrong is important, because it really does help other people learn from them, even if it's something as small as securing the slide on a platform. So those are some examples of science tales, but we do have other ways to get involved and to share things. First of all, we have a science glossary. This is just a screenshot of that there. Although we are encouraging researchers to be mostly informal and avoid the use of jargon or discipline-specific language as much as possible, we felt that it was important to have some kind of feature or aspect of the site where people could define terms that they used if they couldn't avoid those kinds of jargony terms. So on this page, people can submit plain language or comical definitions of terminology in their fields of study. These posts can be directly connected to a science tale, or they can stand on their own. One other thing we were trying to capture with this was often in different fields or subfields, the same word can mean different things. In our field, for example, health is a very big and hard to define word. So we thought it would be interesting to try and capture what or the ways in which people in different disciplines are using the same word. The other thing we have is an art gallery. And so this is where users can submit photos or art related to their research. Again, really, we're open to anything. So you have interesting graphs or diagrams, maybe sketches you made at the beginning of the process. If you have a photo of cool agar plate growth or something, it's really pretty wide open. These can also be directly connected to a science tale, or again, they can be a standalone submission. On the art gallery right now, we have several logo designs that we didn't end up using, but we still wanted to share because they still look really cool. We also have some photos of specific methods that some of us have used throughout our research. So things like bone demineralization or bone segmentation. That's, believe it or not, what's going on here. This is very official and scientific. And then also we have a photo of my dog dressed up to go to a conference. So again, the tone is very informal, and the purpose of the gallery and the glossary is that you know, some people might not be comfortable sharing a full tale or a full story, so we wanted to have other ways to get involved in other mediums for submitting content as well. Yep. And then another thing that we've done, and that is also currently on the gallery of the website, is that we're hoping to bring some of these conversations to conferences and academic conferences in particular. So these final few slides show examples of an activity we recently did at a conference. So at this conference, there was a symposium on unexpected research happenings, which was great because that's also what we want to talk about. So we kind of did an extension of that symposium to keep those conversations going, where we put these posters with different prompts all around the conference so that people could share their stories and advice and things like that as part of this conversation, this wider conversation on unexpected things in science. So we're going to show you just a few of our favorite stories from each poster now. And like I said, these are all on the gallery. So if you want a closer look at any of them, you can also go check that out. So the theme of this first poster was research, flops, twists, and non-starters. So these are people's stories of really unexpected things that happened to them over the course of their research to either, maybe completely derail it or maybe just change the direction or focus of their work. So one person, our first person over here, shared that they used the wrong chemical concentration and had to start everything over. And they rated that for monies in terms of how expensive that was. Someone over here also had some sample issues. They spent 100+ hours prepping samples that ended up being unusable, which is very frustrating, but does happen. This person started out very optimistic in their research. These data are great. This is, definitely a Nature publication. Oh wait, the samples are polluted and all rubbish. So there's definitely a theme going on of, starting out really excited and then finding out that your samples aren't exactly what you thought. And this final story here is someone who went all the way to Europe for 2 months with a 3D scanner. And then the scanner broke on the second day. And I know that pain. So this is not mine, but yeah. Let's let Akacia finish us off.
Yeah, so the next one we also had for weird research stories, because sometimes you just have odd things that you encounter or happen during your research. We also had a case of someone's dog actually eating the homework. So while prepping for their proposal, they handwrote some of their key points and they wanted to address, but 5 minutes before their presentation, their dog literally ate their notes. Or working in Russia equals super awkward right now, which I don't envy. The other one is you can take 150 teeth from Europe to Canada and your carry-on without a single question or concern, because it is not actually something you have to declare. And the last we had was hiking up and down a mountain all day and finding a toilet in the middle of the woods on a mountain ridge. Yeah. And then finally, we have this poster, and we were asking people to give advice to their past selves and things they wish they had known when they started their research, which was really great because as we're talking, a lot of people essentially coming and being really kind with the hindsight. And so one is everyone gets imposter syndrome, which is kind of something we've talked, and one thing we hope with sharing their stories we can help alleviate, and that these things aren't just happening to you, they happen to all of us. Other is your PhD is not your life's work. Your best work will come later, which I think is important for all of us to hear, especially in the thick of graduate school sometimes. And very similarly, the only good PhD is a finished PhD. And this one, which, yeah, it's okay to cry a lot. Sometimes you just have to let it out. Yeah, so just to wrap up, the goal of our projects and sharing some of these stories with you is to promote science communication in all its form, and we hope to gather stories and related content across different fields and to make and maintain connections between public audiences, researchers, whether that be in academia or in industry, and between all of our disciplines. We think that talking about our failures and the behind-the-scene process is a really important tool for bridging the gap between the popular conceptions of science and the actual reality of what that science looks like, both for general audiences and for researchers themselves, so we can feel less alone when things go wrong.
All right, and then this is just our website link and the QR code to get to the website, and then also our Twitter handle, which also has a bunch of links. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brianne and Akacia. Questions, comments, discussion points? Joanna.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you for really useful, interesting presentation and talks about very important things in science and research. One thing, I guess it's a question, and depending on the outcome, a recommendation, which is I wonder if you've considered how this project might evolve, thinking about as people are getting to the point of like applying for jobs and tenure, promotion and hiring, and thinking about how, because this project like really nicely captures failures in research, particularly for grad students, but kind of as we get to the point where we're thinking about, as grad students, thinking about kind of next steps and thinking about careers, I wonder if there's a space for this project to also consider how to articulate these failures kind of at a hiring committee, or how when you're at tenure and promotion committees, you can kind of talk about this as being a learning opportunity. Obviously, I think you've got like a really good project that's also you've got a lot going on at the moment, so I don't want to kind of say here's another thing for you to do as well, but just as the project evolves, it might be worth thinking about kind of how you incorporate that kind of next step, the kind of becoming professors or researchers and communicating this more broadly as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and also recommendation. Really appreciate that. We definitely, starting out, wanted this to be to sort of include everyone, because it is important as well for faculty and people who are higher up than just graduate students to be able to talk about these things. We have been finding that especially because there's so much fewer opportunities to do that as graduate students, we ended up prioritizing that a little bit more. But we're definitely hoping to grow in a direction to also encompass the sort of more higher echelons of academia as well. And I definitely think maybe having some sort of way to allow people to translate this as or frame this as like a learning opportunity would be really great. So yeah, that's something we'll have to think on for sure. Thank you.
Can I just add a comment to Joanne's question, which is one of the things that when people come to Spark and have research conversations that we always talk about that doesn't get taught a lot in academic training is that a research project is very much a project. And everything that has been learned in project management is about being able to break projects down into much smaller, discrete parts. But that's not how we tend to approach research projects and having plan Bs and all of these pieces. And so I find that as I help particularly graduate students break down large theses or major research projects into discrete steps, then any given step going wrong doesn't have to feel like the end of the world, and it doesn't have to feel like something that when you're presenting it to a thesis committee, when you're making a hiring decision, it can become an anecdote in the process. It doesn't mean that your whole thesis has fallen apart. It doesn't mean that it's all happened because you've been building up piece by piece. And I think, some of these project management fundamentals, they make the mistakes as part of the process just not be nearly as big a deal as I think people fear that they're going to be.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And that's definitely something that we wanted to, we're like throughout all of this trying to emphasize is that you're like making those mistakes is like, that's expected. That's completely fine. That's normal. And learning to deal with those mistakes and pivot to have those plan Bs, that's an important skill as a researcher. And especially from our sort of conference activity, we heard from a lot of people, they would share everything that went wrong on the Post-it note, but then in actual conversations, you're able to talk a little bit more about how they recovered from that. And for the most part, it works out fine. You figure something else out, you do come out with a final product. So it's just being able to handle those mistakes when they happen and realize that it's not going to be the end of the world for your project.
Shahad had a question about whether you find that there's been public engagement with a project from people outside of academia, and if so, how has it been received?
I can maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, we're still very much in the phases of getting us set up and start out. So like this conference that we did was one of the first kind of big activities. So we're still working and building up content. And I think right now we don't have a lot of engagement with folks outside of academia, but a lot of that is right now we're really focused on trying to build that content and get stories. So that's a really great question. And I think that's definitely, as we kind of get a base of content for our website, is our next steps to how do we more actively engage with not public audiences, or not academic audiences, sorry.
I'd really like to hear what, if any, effect this has had on your own work or your own mental health and stress level around your research.
So both of us are in a cohort where we were ready to go on our fieldwork in May of 2020. So things went very, very wrong. I think for both of us, our projects completely changed, and we'd already had this website and a lot of the ideas at that point, but that was we were more focused on sort of the non-significant results part of it at that point. And when that happened, and we essentially, couldn't do the research that we'd written all these proposals and papers about, it became like really clear that we wanted to pivot to this new direction, to talking about things that had gone wrong. Because, and another thing that is very obvious now, but didn't really feel like it at the time, was that happened to everyone. The pandemic really messed up everyone's projects, and talking to more people about that and hearing how it had affected them, I think really helped push us in this direction, because it was helpful to hear other people's stories and to feel a little bit less isolated in that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, at the conference, a lot of those stories of research twists were very much, things about research getting delayed again and again and constantly, or having to completely shift your project to use data that already existed because you could no longer go and get it for your project. So I think it was really, it was really nice. It was almost really cathartic to be able to have these conversations and see it, and see your little story amongst so many others with really similar, having similar experiences. So I think, also very, very much helped just in not feeling alone. And like Brianne said, it kind of felt like it at the beginning, but actually being amongst all of that. So it's been really nice. And also just to think in the future of now, it's like, well, if I make a mistake, got another story for the website. So
I think one of the things that's really interesting about this, and why we were really excited to have you talk, is that at Spark we've been doing a bunch of work recently with the library and others around research data management, and this push towards much greater transparency in the research process. And when you have things like pre-registration, where you have to say, okay, this is my hypothesis I'm going to test, these are the methods I'm going to use, and then you do it, it becomes very, it becomes non-optional to say if something didn't work. And I think that what we're going to see as these ideas in research data management continue is a lot more pressure around people being open about tests that don't work, non-significant results, all of these pieces, and then the decisions that get made that address what to do after that and how they then go on to find something that they can publish. And so it's interesting because this is really about like a culture change in academia, and this sense of, needing to seem like it all worked perfectly and everyone has it completely together. But I think the lighthearted tone of this is such an important starting place, because until you can normalize it as a culture, it's going to be incredibly hard to stick it into a publication.
Yeah,
and
that is actually, no, that is kind of purposeful, I think. When we started out with the more non-significant part of this, we did want it to be a little more formal, but like, again, when everything went wrong and we just wanted to talk to other people, it felt much better to do that in a more informal kind of way. And I think yeah, maybe not taking ourselves so seriously might help a little bit in terms of like reducing some of the pressure that there can be around being in academia or around academic publishing. And yeah, just knowing that, you know, your first hypothesis does not have to be correct, I think is really useful.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, you know, there's a lot of things, even in how we do things, kind of with Brianne talking about her story of using styrofoam cup and floral foam. Like, that's the kind of stuff, it's really useful and you'd love to know it, but people don't want to put that in the methods section. They don't want to put like, oh, we use styrofoam cups, we use Play-Doh, we use all this. And I had a very similar for my master's where I was doing tooth sectioning, but I needed to find a way to stabilize the tooth. And I'm just like, what do I do? And it was like zip ties and clay. But I wasn't going to put that in the, like, I was terrified of putting that in the methods, just so other researchers who also have that panic moment of like getting to that step and being like, oh, wait, how do I do this? And it can be really hard, right? Because you don't want to say these things because it doesn't sound very fancy, even though it's very effective. And then essentially as researchers, we're all forced to reinvent the wheel every time we get to that because we're not having open discussions about it too. And yeah, just opening it up to be like, it's okay if it's not fancy. Like duct tape plays a critical, I think, in a lot of sciences, and that's okay.
Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure everyone else has too.
Thank you for having us.
And Joanna says, "And more conference dogs, please."
Of
And
course.
thank you everyone for joining us. You'll see in the chat, I included a literal one, I think it's a 1-question survey. It's very helpful for us in planning Spark Talks to get a sense of what people are interested in and what you take away from the talks. So thank you everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.